The midnight reunion. Ellie had always hated New Year's Eve. For most, it was a time of celebration. But for her, it was a stark reminder of all the unresolved questions in her life. Questions about her family, her childhood, and most of all, the old manor where she'd spent countless summers as a kid. That's why the envelope startled her. It arrived on the morning of December 31st, thick and yellowed, with handwriting she didn't recognize. The message was brief and unsettling. Midnight. The old manor. Don't come alone. Ellie's first thought was to ignore it. The manor had been abandoned for years after her grandparents passed away. It wasn't a place people went willingly. It was a place people whispered about. But curiosity got the better of her. She called her brother Jake, who was just as wary. "Ellie, this sounds like a bad idea," he said over the phone. "What if it's some sort of trap?" "Then we spring it together," Ellie replied. "I can't explain it, Jake. Something about this feels important." Reluctantly, Jake agreed. By 11:45 p.m., they stood before the iron gates of the manor, the cold wind whipping at their coats. The house loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now crumbling, ivy swallowing the walls. A single light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. "Who lit that?" Jake asked, gripping a flashlight. "No idea," Ellie muttered. The gates groaned as they pushed them open, the sound echoing through the still night. The path to the front door was overgrown, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. When they reached the front door, Ellie hesitated. "Are we really doing this?" Jake gave her a small nod. "We've come this far." With a deep breath, Ellie pushed the door open. The inside of the manor was worse than she remembered. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs draped the corners, and the air was icy cold. But what caught her attention was the table in the center of the grand hall. A clock sat atop it, ticking ominously. Surrounding the clock were objects she recognized immediately: her old teddy bear, Jake's baseball cap, and their mother's locket. "This isn't random," Jake said, his voice shaking. Ellie was about to respond when the clock chimed. Midnight. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the house. Then the door slammed shut behind them. The air grew colder and whispers began to fill the room. "Do you hear that?" Ellie whispered. Before Jake could answer, a shadow appeared at the top of the grand staircase. It descended slowly, and as it stepped into the light, Ellie's breath caught. It was their grandfather. "Grandpa," she said, her voice trembling. "But he's been dead for years," Jake stammered. The man smiled, but it was an unsettling smile, hollow, almost cruel. "I've been waiting for you." The room began to change. The walls shimmered, transforming into scenes from the past. They saw their grandparents arguing in the kitchen, their father slamming a door, their mother weeping in the garden. The images were vivid, painful, and impossible to look away from. "What is this?" Ellie demanded. "It's the truth," their grandfather said. "Our family has been built on secrets, lies. Tonight, you will decide if the cycle ends with you." The scene shifted again, this time to the backyard. Their grandfather stood over a hole in the ground, holding a small box. He buried it quickly, glancing over his shoulder as if he feared being caught. "What did you bury?" Jake shouted. But their grandfather didn't answer. Instead, he turned to them, his eyes dark and piercing. "Go to the backyard, find it, and be ready to face what comes next." The next thing they knew, they were standing in the backyard. The air was frigid, the moon casting eerie shadows across the overgrown grass. A single shovel leaned against the tree where their grandfather had been in the vision. "Do we dig?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer. He picked up the shovel and began to dig. Minutes passed in tense silence, the only sound the scrape of metal against dirt. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. Jake pulled out a small, rusted box. Ellie opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, written in their grandfather's handwriting. "To whoever finds this," it began, "I am writing this because I can no longer bear the weight of what I've done. Years ago, in a moment of panic, I committed a terrible act. It was an accident, but instead of owning up to it, I let someone else take the blame. My own brother, your uncle. He was innocent, but I allowed him to be exiled from the family to protect my reputation." Ellie's hands shook as she read. She didn't even know they had an uncle. The letter continued, "I buried this truth to spare myself, but it has haunted me every day since. If you are reading this, it is your responsibility to make things right. Find him. Tell him the truth. Let our family heal." As the first light of the new year broke over the horizon, Ellie and Jake stood in silence, the weight of the letter pressing down on them. Their family's history was darker than they'd ever imagined, but they had the chance to set things right. They vowed to find their uncle, to uncover the rest of the truth, and to break the cycle of secrets that had defined their family for generations. As they turned to leave, Ellie glanced back at the manor. It stood silent, its secrets finally unearthed. Or so she thought. From an upstairs window, a shadow watched them go.